The fight to end slavery.
Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad.
Harriet Tubman made the American dream possible for some, despite her conflict and their conflicts with slavery.
Her courageous and selfless acts saved the lives of many African Americans through the Underground Railroad, a compromise for those who wanted to have freedom.
Africans and their descendants were being brought to America starting around 1619 to be sold as slaves to help speed up the process of farming. If the slave owners didn't want a slave, they would sell them as if they were property to other slave owners, also known as slave masters. The slaves were transported on slave ships. They used slave ships between 1540 and 1850. Slaves were transported in very horrible conditions. Each slave got around 7 square feet to be in. They usually had to lay down for the whole ride. Sicknesses and diseases would ride on the boat and spread to a lot of the slaves. About half could die from one disease. They would get fed twice a day and were forced to get exercise on days with good weather.
Slaves were sustained by force, the threat of humiliation, beatings, abuse, and the fear of being separated from family. They were forced to do the same job most days, although it did vary by seasons. The jobs for the slaves varied from building boats to furniture to ironing clothes and other items.
Slaves had to learn to defend themselves against snakes, alligators, and other harmful creatures using nothing but garden tools. Working on a rice plantation was better than working on a tobacco plantation because when you were done with your work, you had the freedom to go fish, hunt, and anything else that you needed to do to help you and your family if you had one.
Around 1786, George Washington had a slave that once escaped. A group of Quakers helped the slave escape to freedom. This is an idea happening so much, it turned into a popular way of freeing slaves. They would call it secret code names like railroad and conductor, so the slave guards or owners wouldn't understand what they were talking about.
In 1777, the Declaration of Independence inspired the state of Vermont to end slavery in the northern colonies. This didn't happen quickly. By 1850, the northern colonies had very few slaves, but there was still slavery in the southern colonies like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia.
There were many people who wanted to try to stop slavery, and Harriet Tubman was one of the most important. Harriet Tubman was born in 1822 as a slave. Harriet's family was born into slavery. When she was growing up, she married John Tubman in 1844. Harriet thought the plantation was going to be sold, so she wanted to run away, but John didn't agree with her decision. So Harriet went with her 2 brothers. Following the North Star, she found freedom. Once she was free, Harriet decided to help free other slaves as well.
The Underground Railroad was a successful way to bring people out of slavery. With Harriet Tubman's efforts, thousands of slaves were freed from slavery and brought to the North. Upon her journeys, she saved hundreds of families and individuals. She made a total of 19 trips back to the South, freeing around 300 people on her own, and encouraged others to continue along with her works and the railroad's philosophy. She had numerous disguises and ways to get around cities as well as people. People would blindly follow their conductor, like Harriet, as they traveled through the night to get to their freedom.
Slaves would escape from their plantations in the dead of night to go and meet up with a conductor. The conductor would take runaway slaves to a safe location or safe house. When they arrived at a safe house, they were most likely greeted by a Quaker who gave them food and new clothes to wear for the rest of their journey. The safe houses would be likely a Quaker's house they would be giving up for the slaves. They would sleep at the safe house during the day, then leave at night. They would hurry through the night to get to the next safe house or station and seek shelter there. Slaves would had to be extra careful about moving around and being out in the open, as they would be constantly hunted by their former masters. It was very dangerous to run away, especially if you were careless about your movements and positions.
President Abraham Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation to end slavery. With slave owners being slave owners, his proclamation was a load of garbage and was not worth listening to. They still kept their slaves, which made the country go to war, and they used the proclamation at the winning peak of the war as a secret weapon. It seemed much more important during the war than later. Once Harriet was done working as a conductor, she went into military service. She worked as a nurse for Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. She met many black and white soldiers alike fighting. Harriet learned many patient stories and told them to others. Her kindness and compassion towards the men caught the attention of many high-profile fighters and government employees. She was able to go on combat missions as well as being a spy for the North. When she retired from service, she was granted rights that were very luxurious for African Americans at the time, not to mention being a woman. Many high-profile white men would write to each other talking about Harriet and her great works.
People were influenced to run away from their masters because of the choice of freedom. Masters were getting aggravated at losing their slaves and laborers. White people in the North who were pro-slavery were getting mad at how many African Americans were integrating into their land and taking over some businesses and homes.
Slavery was abolished and almost all slaves left their masters. Some may have been hired to work for their old master as a paid laborer. President Lincoln made a law stating that all blacks would be free and treated as equals to whites.
People who were affected by the end of slavery and the Underground Railroad were rich white men, slave masters, African Americans, and people living in the South. Slave masters were upset because they lost their slaves and laborers. African Americans were affected by being free from their masters and given a chance to live like an equal. Some rich white men were happy with the end of slavery because they were able to hire the former slaves, and others were upset because they were also slave masters.
The world itself wasn't very different as a whole. The United States and Africa were different, though. Africa was different because their people were not being stolen by Americans and other Africans who were being paid or bribed to steal other Africans to be brought to America to work as slaves. The United States was very different because our country was no longer divided by the North and South. Our country would also be very different because blacks were no longer considered 3/5 of a person and were no longer considered property of their old masters.
The long-term significance of Harriet Tubman and her efforts of the Underground Railroad were women can do anything, and more importantly, slaves were free from their prison of a plantation. She fought through hundreds of miles to free her fellow former slaves, giving them a chance at real life besides the one behind the fence gates of the plantations.
The biggest unintended consequence of the end of slavery was the Civil Rights Movement and all of its violent acts. But at the same time, the movement gave the African American people another voice to follow. The consequences of the Civil Rights Movement and slavery were great. Hundreds of people died because of the choices to own African Americans and to those who decided to abuse, criticize, and harm African American people.
Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad were the roadmap for many historical events. Harriet and her courage showed that people of any gender or race can do anything they put their mind to. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would not have been able to do this great works to help civil rights movement, and Harriet Tubman not to fight so hard to free African American people. Harriet, as well as other conductors, helped influence the African Americans to do their great works to help their people.
In conclusion, without one of the greatest Underground Railroad conductors, Harriet Tubman, the American dream may not have been reached by some. As they faced the conflict of slavery, many Africans still hoped for a compromise to the end. She had put aside her feelings and took people under her wing to bring them safely to the North.
Without Harriet and the rest of the team of conductors, tens of thousands of African Americans may have lost their lives of being struck as laborers.